Morning. Today is the 21st, June 21st, the 11th of Tammuz. Can you imagine? We're already 11 days into Tammuz. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, the sixth chapter, and we are on Nun Zayin Amud Beis. That's 57B. You might, with Hashem's help, have the opportunity to jump onto 58A today or tomorrow. And it's quite a milestone. We're moving right along. New topic, broadly about which kind of adornments, Ch6, may be worn on Shabbas in the public domain, with a little discussion about if there is, or I should say, are any restrictions in other spaces like a Karmelis or a Chatzir. So those things will come up. And we took a small detour and we're talking about the laws of Chatzitza. They're immediately relevant to the laws of Shabbas, or at least mostly relevant, namely because they help us with the definition of the items we are discussing. And more importantly, one of the reasons why one would be restricted from wearing a specific item has to do with the probability of it needing to be removed at a certain point in time. Yeah. And because the rabbis really want to avoid carrying on Shabbos, they may have restricted certain garments. And we're going to see there are some criteria. For example, garments that one would never remove are likely not included. I'm going to share the screen. And I just want to show you, I told you about a book that I received actually when I was a kid. So I'm sure they have a more updated version, but they have a illustrated, well, you can't see it because of my silly background here, but there's an illustrated Mishnayos. And so I took a few pictures. And so we'll start with this. We're talking about the katla. We described a bib-like garment, which also had some kind of decoration. So I'm not sure if it's precisely this idea, but it looks like they studied some of the kind of, what's the right way to describe it? Specialty garments, or the kind of garments. And so this is their conception. It's a highly decorated garment that has a bib-like form. And they even added on some lace to show that it's a high quality, high grade schmancy kind of clothing. And then also, while we're at it, this is the choker we talked about, right? It has a portion of the garment that pushes up on the neck, and at least the person that chooses to wear it, we said yesterday, is choosing to be choked. And as you can see, it creates a very fashionable double chin, which at least in certain times and places was considered a sign of affluence, and it was considered a sign of or a form of a type of beauty. And so there, I just wanted to show you that picture, and we'll revert back to these pictures. Again, there are multiple opinions and multiple nuanced impressions of what these different items may look like, but we can refer here just for some idea. So for example, we talked about ear shell zahav. I don't think everybody agrees with this, but they say that it was literally a head kind of a garment that had a what do you call it? Skyscape, a city. What do you call that?
Landscape, nof, like
not landscape, but like a city skyline. It has a skyline on it. So could you imagine that this might be a new kind of thing? We could start selling like Manhattan, or Hollywood, Hallandale Beach. We could get like the Beach Club and La Mer and the hotels. You think anyone would go for that?
Better with Yerushalayim.
Oh, Yerushalayim, okay. Yeah, I think Yerushalayim would be more popular. All right, let's take a look at the Gemara, and we'll revert back just to show you here. They're trying to show, at least this would be according to Rashi, how you have certain strings that are interwoven into the braid. Again, this we discussed two sessions ago. And here we said that there are things dangling. Well, we'll discuss this today, actually, so stand.
Looks like a challah.
The hair looks like a challah. That's what you mean. Indeed.
Braid.
Well, braid.
The challah.
I'll tell you something. I don't have a lot of experience with braids, but I do have a few daughters in my house and a wife. And apparently there is a lot in common, or there could be in common, between how you braid a hair and how you braid a challah. At least at a starting point.
You can see them doing it on Hallandale Beach anytime you want.
Yeah. All right, so now we're going to go on to a new or somewhat new discussion in the Gemara. As you may recall, we quoted a Mishnah, not in our Gemara, a Mishnah in Ch6 Mikvahs that was talking about the laws of Chatzitz. And Bli neder, well, bli neder. If I'm not mistaken, this is the final discussion about mikvah and chatzitza, and it's going to be a little bit technical. We'll go through it fast. The bottom line will be, I just want to tell you this. The bottom line is a lot more straightforward than the journey. So we'll go through it and we'll see where we're headed. Rabbi Yehuda argues in the Mishnah about certain items, if they are considered a chatzitza, if they are considered an interference between the water and the hair, the water and the body. Rabbi Yehuda says, shel tzemer, if we have strings of wool or shel seyar, and we'll just go back to the challah braiding picture for a moment. Imagine something to this effect, at least the way Rashi explains it. So if it's made out of wool or hair, and at the end of yesterday's discussion, we talked about human hair, which is what we're talking about, in my understanding. It's not a chatzitza because they are water, they're not waterproof. Water can flow through it. So this is his statement. The earlier statement in the Mishnah says, Shel tzemer v'shel pishtim chaytzitzim. If it's made out of wool or made out of linen, it is a chatzitza. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So we have a tradition in the name of Shmuel to say, Halacha ke Rav Yehuda v'chutei seyar. When it comes to the halachic practice, what do we do? What is a chatzitza? What is not a chatzitza? Well, I'll tell you one thing. Human hair, no chatzitza. Halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda b'chutei seyar. We follow Rabbi Yehuda. That hair, maybe we call this highlights today. Or maybe I'm showing my ignorance in women's hair fashion, so I should be careful. So chutei seyar, strings of hair, is not a chatzitza. And this is in accordance to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, just quoted right over here. Again, this is the text of the Mishnah. Shall seyar in chaytzitzim. And Shmuel says, we follow Rabbi Yehuda in the realm of chutei seyar, although tzemer, wool, is considered an interference. Amar le Abaya is now going to challenge Rabbi Yosef, who conveyed a teaching in the name of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Amar le Abaya, halacha, whenever you say we take the halachic position of A, what can we infer? That someone else is arguing with him. If you say we accept the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the inference is that the Chachamim or the Tanna Kama disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, which is a problem because the only person who even mentions seyar, who mentions hair, is Rabbi Yehuda. The first statement in the Mishnah had no mention of human hair. So Amar le Abaya says, I hear what you just said, I hear your teaching. But if we parse your words, halacha, when you say we embrace one opinion, michlal de pligi, we can infer that the earlier opinion disagrees. But that doesn't work because we don't have any text here that says he disagrees. The chitema, maybe you're going to say we need to put on our thinking caps and get all analytical and say as follows. Ilav de shamei letanakama, the iri b'chutei seyar. The first opinion in the Mishnah, although it doesn't state here, if we read between the lines, it must be talks of hair. Why? Because otherwise, why is Rabbi Yehuda talking about hair? Because if not for that, you and Nami will have a Mari. So basically, if you'll say, we can read between the lines and assume that the Tanna Kama did talk about hair. Because if not, Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't talk about hair either. That doesn't work. Why? Because it would not be unheard of for a Mishnah to have the following kind of dialogue. Opinion, the first rabbi, Tanna Kama, says, here are the laws. Wool, linen is an interference. Rabbi Yehuda chimes in and says, I disagree with you about wool. And kishem, and he's saying, you know what? You should agree with me about wool, and also you should probably agree with me about hair. And so basically, sometimes we could have a dialogue. You could have half the conversation, and I can add on items, even if you didn't take a position. And again, as I told you, the process sounds a little bit meandering, but when we get to the bottom line, you'll see it. Itmar. Let's figure this out once and for all. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, Moedim Chachamim leRabbi Yehuda b'chutei seyar. In truth, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who takes the position about hair, but everybody would agree with him. And indeed, we have a teaching of Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, who's the same rabbi who taught this original teaching. And he says that everybody agrees with hair that it is not a chatzitza. So now let me give you the bottom line. Rav Yosef quoted Shmuel. The language he used sounded like there's a disagreement, but Abaye with his deduction proves that there is no disagreement. In truth, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama would agree that hair is not a interference. And now we quoted from another rabbi, another chain of tradition. We have Shmuel saying that very precise item, that everybody agrees that hair is not a chatzitza. So the whole confusing part was just the Gemara parsing through the words to see if they could all agree. And ultimately, the conclusion is they can agree. Everyone agrees hair in this format is not a chatzitza. And actually, there's even a brisa that says this exact comment. Chutei tzemer chaytzisim, chutei seir ein chaytzisim. Wool is a chatzitza. Hair is not a chatzitza. Rabbi Yehuda chimes in, shel semer v'shel seir ein chaytzisim. Wool and hair are not a chatzitza. So we see opinion A, opinion B, they disagree about some stuff about wool, but they all agree that hair is not a chatzitza. That's the bottom line. That's the whole Megillah. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Masnisa Namideka. If you read carefully in the Mishnah, hold on, let's just Masnisa Namideka. Our Mishnah actually indicates that everybody agrees about hair. Why? Diktani, let's reread our Mishnah. Yoitza, well, it's actually a later Mishnah. We didn't read it. Yoitza Isha v'chutei seyar. The Mishnah later on in our Masechta says a woman may go out with chutei seyar, with strands of hair, bein mishal chaverta, whether it's her own hair, you can cut your hair and then use it to decorate your hair, ay mishal chaverta, or of a human hair of another person. Mani, whose opinion is this? Ilay Rabbi Yehuda. This doesn't make sense to be Rabbi Yehuda because he is even more expansive. Afilu chutei tzamer nami. He would even agree that wool is acceptable. This is a teaching of Rabbanan. And we infer from the Mishnah later on in our chapter that everybody agrees that human hair, when it's wrapped into the hair, is not considered a chatzitza, and it is acceptable to go out like that on Shabbos. Shma mina. So long discussion, but the bottom line is very simple. Abaye infers with logic and then is confirmed by three different texts. A tradition from the original author Shmuel indicating that everybody agrees, a brisa recording that everybody agrees, and a careful reading of a Mishnah down the line that also indicates that everybody agrees human hair is not a chatzitza. Human hair is can be considered for the purposes of halacha as not a typical adornment that needs to be removed. Rather, it's something that allows water to flow through, and it's not a chatzitza on the mikvah, and therefore it's acceptable on Shabbos. That is our last discussion for the moment about mikvah. Any comments or questions before we jump into a more familiar and different pace of Gemara?
Rabbi, let me ask a stupid question.
No such thing as a stupid question. Go ahead.
The woman has hair on her body. What is she supposed to do if she would not be allowed to go out?
No, we're not talking about human hair. I mean, we're not talking about the hair that's attached to a human person. We're talking about hair that's added as an adornment, and that's what we're talking about.
I was going to say the waxing studios would have been very busy.
However, I will say that human hair, wherever it may be, does need to be not clumped. It should be combed. But most of human hair, that's not really a concern. It's more the hair of the head that could be an issue potentially. And here we're talking again about something that's added onto the hair. It's like well, as you see in this picture. So here they're using some kind of other string, but imagine you could use hair to be a highlight of sorts, to add texture or color or body volume to the hair. Again, admittedly, this is very much not my area of expertise, although maybe I'm saying that too often in this year, but certainly about hair dressing and hair doing and that kind of thing, I have limited experience thus far. Come back to me in a few years and maybe I'll know a whole lot more. But So that,
I'm 85 years old. I don't know anything yet.
all right. But hold on, but your children, more boys or more girls?
I have one girl, two boys.
Okay. All right. So, and on the 8 o'clock?
And Baruch Hashem, 4 and 1.
4 boys.
Rabbi, what's the
4 boys. And
You see,
Rosalie has 4 boys.
there's a lot more boys than girls. Okay, so we understand, Rebbe.
what's the problem with the woman going into a mikvah with the hair?
No, there's no problem with women going.
No.
That's exactly what we said. There's no problem for a woman to go into the mikvah with hair.
But
However, there are other kind of hair adornments
okay,
and hair attachments and hair pieces of all different kinds of style that we don't even really use very frequently today. That may be a concern.
but there's something they don't know. They didn't know.
What didn't they know?
They didn't know. First of all, I'm sure women didn't take a shower every day
Probably not.
and shampoo their hair because hair has lots of oil on it. So the water wouldn't penetrate the hair because the oil is over it.
Well, it's not about
No.
penetrating the single hair. It's a question of if the water can penetrate through the hairs. And so for the purposes of the halacha over here, the established halacha is, for whatever reason, and I suspect there's a little more to the subject of why hair would not be a problem. I'm just holding off from discussing it because I want to make sure it's confirmed by, but suffice it to say, I have a theory that I'll share with you maybe tomorrow if I do some research about hair. But the bottom line is that ultimately the halacha does not consider hair to be a chatzitza. Hair is not a problem. Actually, give me a second. Let me just see if there's
Could be serious today, Rabbi. They have gels. I'm sure that's what Alan's referring to. There's some of those gels. Water would never come close to the hair.
Look, also, there's such a thing, I think, what's the right word to call them? Where your hair could become very knotty and gnarly. Is it acceptable to call that an afro? Or is that what they call it? Where the hair could be quite,
Yeah.
impenetrable.
An afro looks like a beehive.
Yeah. So that might actually be a problem if the person never cleans it. And then we have to add, if you have an afro and you're going to mikvah, you should probably consult with a competent halachic authority. And you might also want to ask the permission of the mikvah, because depending what's inside that afro, there might need to be a special cleaning afterwards. But again, I know very little about afros too, so.
There might be colonies of little ants.
Yeah. It's very interesting, Rabbi, because it's a current problem. I saw some pictures of the Ethiopians in Israel, and some of the hairstyles are close to your pictures in your book.
Listen, well, exactly. That's what I was trying to show you. There are many people that come from, I don't know if the word Edut Mizrach, the
Right.
Eastern countries, Bukhara, even Iran. There's different heritage clothing or ethnic, what's the word, designs. And I know, for example, 2 communities that preserve it are the Bukharian community and the Persian community. If you go to a wedding, you might see them all dressed up in this really cool but not quite familiar fashion. And once upon a time, you got to imagine that was the fashion. And therefore, and I think those items of clothing are somewhat closer to some of the items we're discussing today than what we're talking about now.
Or Alex's bris for his son.
Yes. And then also, I mean, I don't want to discriminate. I know Moroccan Jews also preserve certain garb for special events, but not quite like this. Them, it's more the men wearing those cute, those cool hats and robes, at least in my experience. If anyone here knows more, you're more than welcome to share that. I'm just looking for one item. If I don't see it in a second, I'm gonna hold off. No, I'll have to do a little more research. Okay, let's see the next chapter of the Gemara, and we're gonna be moving on from the Chatzitza discussion. Lo,
We might as well say hair today, gone tomorrow if we're moving on.
Loibit.
Just cut it short, Bernie.
When we write our sefer of all our Kedushim, we're gonna have to also keep a collection of Gemara-related puns.
Right.
So.
Right.
All right, lo betotefes. The Mishnah says that a woman may not wear something called a totefes. The Gemara is now going to have a little bit of a dialogue about a totefes, and we're going to see some of the same chachamim, same tzaddikim, same amoraim, sages of the Gemara having this conversation. My totefes. What is a totefes? Amar Rav Yosef, chumarta diktifta. Rashi explains it's a kesher she'oisim l'refuas kitav einar shleik tishlet. Okay, so we're actually going to have a machlokes, Rashi and Rabbi Steinsaltz, which really means a machlokes of the different commentaries. Rabbi Steinsaltz says that it is a chumarta diktifta. It's a packet of spices that was understood, and let's not rehash the whole discussion about kameya, but suffice it to say that in the ancient world, there were different supernatural, spiritual, or alternative kinds of healing that were fairly prevalent.
Rabbi, it's not so ancient. I remember my my grandmother putting a little pack of garlic against colds that I wore on a string around my neck. Not
Correct.
so ancient.
Oh, correct. So these kind of things trickle down to this very day. And considering that we have some medical people and a pharmacist, maybe there are actually healing properties to some of these things, garlic, onion. I don't know enough about it to weigh in, but suffice it to say that in the time of the Gemara, this was very common. I was even listening to a podcast on the subject. And in those days, it seems in general, there was two types of doctors. You had doctors that were more conventional, and you had more mystical, spiritual, I don't know the word is, but supernatural kind of healers. And they were both considered, they were both in that time considered equal options when you were considering your health concerns. Now, maybe it might be today akin to a medical doctor who focuses more on the mind, because I think but anyway, suffice it to say, if it is a packet of spices, or Rashi explains, it was a certain kind of nut, also a supernatural kind of, actually, this might be what Rashi is saying. Okay. It's a nut, a packet, I think the kitov maybe with incense or spices that would affect the Ein Hara somehow. I don't know if it was a nasty smelling packet and no one felt jealous of you when you walked around. I don't know exactly how that worked, but let's see any other commentaries.
Alan, you remember camphor squares?
We still sell them.
Yeah.
But a lot of people take garlic on a daily basis. Garlic pills.
The camphor squares they wore around their necks.
Yeah, but a lot of people take garlic pills.
Yeah.
And boy, do they give off odors.
Keeps away the mosquitoes.
Listen, if it keeps social distancing. All right. Yeah, it was a little packet with spices and other things which were known to affect or prevent an Ein Hara.
Rabbi, it's irrelevant what's in it. It's the carrying of something around your neck. That's the question, I presume.
Yes, correct. No, I'm looking now. There are different nuanced interpretations. Was it spices? Was it a gem? There were different things. Suffice it to say, it wasn't quite conventional medicine, but it was known to keep away the Ein Hara. Amalei Abaye says, if that's the case, if that's really what a totefes is, teve kameya mumche v'tishteri. This should then have the same halacha as an amulet that is known to be effective. If it is understood to be effective, you may carry it around, or not carry, you may wear it around. And I just want to remind everyone that we're going to discuss more about kameyas in a few pages. So on Samach or Samach Aleph is where the discussion is. And I was just seeing some of the commentaries that were quoting the Gemara there, and there really is a certain psychological component. If you understand this kameya to be entirely effective, you're not going to mess around with it, and you're not going to take it off, and you're not going to carry it. But if you're uncertain about its effectiveness, you'll be a little more comfortable removing it. And if you remove it, well, then you might be in that very undesirable position of carrying something on Shabbos. So Abaya challenges this first definition. He says, if it's really this little packet of spice, then it should be acceptable on Shabbos. Rather, we need a new definition. There is an alternative interpretation, which is Afuz Zayoni, or Afuz Yani. What is Afuz Yani? Rashi says, a frontal shel zav, a frontal although I don't know what a frontal is, but I do know a frontal. If you Google the word frontal today in English, which is probably from French, it's a hair. It's a piece of hair that is attached to the front and comes real low. So Rashi seems to be saying it's a kind of golden headband of sorts, an ornament worn on the forehead. Okay. So I'm not going to do it again today, but frontal is a frontal, an ornament placed on the forehead. Indeed, we have learned that we're told Yaitza Isha Bisvacha Mizuheves. Someone may go out with a Svacha Mizuheves, a golden hairnet, Uve Totefes, and with a Totefes, Uve Sarbitin Akvoimba, and with a Sarbitin. 3 different garments. So the question is, Ezo's or Totefes. I'm sorry, this is the teaching we're quoting to ultimately get to the bottom line of what a Totefes is. So we started by saying that a Totefes is this kind of golden thing. And now we're going to prove it from a text. The text, the Brisa says that a woman may go out on Shabbos with the hairnet that's gold, or a Totefes and a Sarbitin. Ezo Totefes ve'ezo Sarbitin. Please give us an explanation. What is this word Totefes and what is Sarbitin? Amar Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Abahu explained, Totefes is a kind of band of gold or decorated band that goes on the forehead. Hamukefes lami oizen, that goes from ear to ear. Sarbitin hamagin la'ad l'chayeha, and a sarbitin is a kind of thing that droops more downward and less across. Rashi hamakefes es hapadachas ma'oizen la'oizen, it goes across the forehead. Hamagim ad l'chayeha al roisha. It goes on the head and things hang down on both sides. Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. Totefes is the thing that goes around her forehead, and Sarbitin are the things that are attached to the net that dangle downwards. Now let's take a look at the picture. Here. This is this illustrator's interpretation. The Totefes would be a band that goes across, and the Sarbitin would be dangles. Bangles? What's? No. What would be like a golden thing that hangs down?
Tchotchkes.
A tchotchke, bling. All right, fine. So Sarbitin means bling. That's attached to the Totefes. And if you notice, she's also wearing some kind of
Schmitchik.
Yeah.
More tchotchkes.
Schmitchik,
I'll tell you this: in the region where she lived, they didn't call it a schmitchik or whatever.
It's
All
called
right.
in French. It's des bebelles.
What is that?
Des bebelles for tchotchkes.
Okay.
I want to know how the rabbis knew such details about jewelry.
They lived in a world where people wore jewelry. You think they were sitting?
We're studying all day. They're studying all day. Where do they have time to notice this?
So first of all, they weren't studying all day. Many of the chachamim of the Gemara had jobs. The Gemara actually attests to it. But they had 2 times a year that they would gather around in particular, called the Kala. And that's when most of the scholarship and most of these texts that we're studying these conversations were collected. I'm not saying everybody. Some of them were full-time Torah scholars.
Hello?
But many of them were actually
Hello?
seasonal.
Yes?
And
Rabbi Yehuda Sandler.
yeah, and so on. Certainly in the time of the Mishnah, and ostensibly in the time of the Gemara too. And they also had their wives probably also wanted the latest style. And so when they came home, the wife says, you got to get me I need another, whatever you call it, I need another.
You got to go back to work.
Yeah. All right. So again, now we have a definition. Totefes is the band. Sarbitin are the things that dangle down. And just going back to this brisa, the Svacha Mizuheves would be a very beautiful golden hairnet, which had different additional items attached to it.
Okay, I apologize. I've got to run my Monday problems.
Beryl, sorry to lose you. Have a wonderful day, Shkai, for being here. And by the way, this might also be a golden hairnet, or at least a hairnet. Make sense? All right, let's continue. Amar Rav Huna taught regarding Totefes, or probably actually regarding the Sarvitin. Aniyos, the girls that were more impoverished, they're poor. Oisan shalmine tzivonim. They would have colorful material that they would hang. Ashirois, those that came from well-to-do families. Oisan shel kasev v'shel zahav. So their dangling decoration that was hanging on their totefes could be made of gold and silver. And this concludes our next little segment of the Gemara, translating two words, or really one word, totefes, of our Mishnah. Does our original Mishnah also mention Sar Vitin? I don't think so, but let's check. No, it's just totefes. But now there's another word. And it's going to lead to some more interesting figuring out. A woman may also not go out on Shabbos with a kabul. What is a kabul? Amar Rav Yanai. Rav Yanai taught, kabul zeh eino yedea mahu. I don't really know what this is. What does he mean? I don't know. He has two options and he wants to figure out which one it is. Ikablo da avdo tanan. Maybe we're discussing what's known as a kavla de avda, a special slave's kavla. Rashi explains, a choisam she'oisam la'eved. It was a certain kind of badge or signet that would go on the garments, l'simin ha'chacha she'eved, so that people would know whose staff he works on. Today, I would say it would be akin to different establishments in the hospitality industry. Their staff wear recognizable garments and maybe even a name tag, which has the name of the hotel.
Logo.
A logo. So if you were on the staff of a certain estate, you would have to wear, or a slave, here we're talking about slaves. So they would have to have a logo so people know who they're working with, what's their deal. And so maybe the Mishnah is saying that you're not allowed to have your slaves go out like this on Shabbos, or your staff, because you're ultimately responsible for the well-being of your staff. But maybe a hairnet, a kippah, a kind of head covering made out of wool, would be acceptable, because it's kikoiveya shetachas hashikva demikrinam mekabel miskashetas. Boy, maybe it's the hairnet that's used for decoration. Alternatively, maybe kippah shel tzemer tanan. Our Mishnah, when it says kabla, really means a hairnet. Kol sheken kabla da'avda, and obviously a slave would not be allowed to go out wearing their logo, their badge, their indication of whose staff they're on. Why would we be more inclined to prohibit a chotam, some kind of badge, and less inclined to prohibit a hairnet? Well, very simple. A hairnet is less likely to be removed, because when you take it off, your hair is going to be exposed, says Rashi. The kiva, the megalia sarah, being that it would cause the hair to be uncovered, loy shofel, she's not going to take it off and show. Maybe yet our Mishnah is talking about a kippah. Why can't you wear it out? We're still afraid she might take it off and show it to someone, because there might be a way for her to maneuver to remove it, and it wouldn't actually cause her hair to be uncovered. Now let's look at some pictures. This is going to be this, I believe, is going to be the hairnet that we're talking about. And this is, I believe, I don't know about the pin part, but this might be what they imagine to be a kavla, although I think this is really meant to be a decorative pin. So maybe we'll just have to use our imagination for this servant's badge. Again, no one else translates it as badge, but I think that's what it might be understood as. So Amar Rav Abahu. So Rav Abahu responds to Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai says, I have a word kavul. The Mishnah says you can't go out wearing it, but there are two words in our language that are called kavul. They're very different, and I'm not sure which one it is. Amar Rav Abahu. So Rav Abahu answers or comments and says, Mistabra kimanda Amar kippah shel tzemer tanan. I think we can reason, we could rationalize and say, we can infer that we're talking about this hairnet. And there's a brisa which really points in this direction.
Him.
Because the Mishnah says that a woman may go out wearing a kabul, a cap of wool,
Right.
uve istama. And what's an istama?
I think it's a good,
Uve istama lechatzer, and you're allowed to wear an istama and a kabul into a chatzer. The Gemara is going to explain what an istama is. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar comments and says, no, I disagree. I say, af bechabul or shus rabin. This kabul may be worn into the public domain. Why? Klal Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had a general rule. Kol shulamata min hashvacha yotzim ba, kol shulamata hashvacha ein yotzim ba. Anything that's worn under a hairnet, you can wear out. You can wear going outside because you're not going to remove it. But if it's on top of the hairnet, that you can't go out. And therefore, the kabul is under the hairnet, or under the decorative hairnet. It's almost like there was like a functionary net, and then there was a decorative thing that went on top of it. And so, there's a brisa that records a debate about if a woman may wear a kippah shel tzemer or a hairnet made out of wool that's being called the kabul. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says you can wear that. From the fact that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that one may wear it out on Shabbos, and he describes it as something on the head, from here we can infer that a kabul is an item that's worn on the head, and this would promote, support the interpretation that a kabul is a hairnet, and reject the interpretation that it's a servant's or a slave's badge. Now that we talked about an istama, what's an istama? My istama. Amar Rabbi Bahu, ready for this? Bizyoni, it's a bizyoni. Shkoyach, now what's a bizyoni? So the Gemara says that too. I don't know what a bizyoni is. Amar Amai bizyoni, Amar Abaya, Amarav, Kolya Perochi. A small hat-like garment that's placed to cover up the little bit of hair at the end of a braid or the end of this decoration. I'm going to read Rashi for you, although he says kind of what I just said. And then we'll try to see if there's anything in the modern world that is a parallel to this definition. Mitznefes kitana. It's a small hat, right? Mitznefes means hat or turban, head covering. La'achar kishureha shekilas roisha. Let's say the woman or the girl braids her hair and then covers those braids. Or at the end of the braid, they use a ponytail or some other kind of band. But whenever you're tying hair together, there's a little bit of hair that protrudes outwards. And they're called like sprouts, hair sprouts. Because they protrude outwards of the ponytail. In ancient decoration and clothing, in ancient fashion, there were these little caps that would go at the end of the braid to cover up the part of the hair that goes outward. I can't quite envision exactly what it looks like, but I'll take Rashi's word for it that such a thing existed in those days. That was to keep the hair that's outside of the ponytail, outside of the oh, you see, Rosh Steindl says it would be like a little ribbon. That would work. And to say that it's a little ribbon or a little bow is a little more conceivable for us to imagine how that might work. Okay, so the hair is in a braid. It's tied at the end, and then the part of hair that goes out, you might have a little clip or a little something that decorates it or covers it. So that's what an istama is. And regarding an istama, Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, just like a kabul, they're also allowed to go with an istama. Kloya prochi. It gathers the hair that protrudes from the headdress. Excuse me. Taner Rabbanan. This is not the end of the discussion about this ribbon. I guess cap is hair cap. Doesn't allow us to conjure the right image. But this material that was covering or adorning and decorating the part of the hair that comes out of the braid. Taner Rabbanan. She never heard of such a thing? Is there in modern, you have a bow, and let's say you tie it at the end, and the hair that comes out has something else you put on it, maybe like a clip or something. Okay. Tana Rabbana, our sages taught about this. Shloisha Dvarim Nemru Be'istama. There are three interesting, unexpected halachas that are said in regards to this istama, which again we said is the thing that decorates up the hair that comes out of the mouth. Ein ba mishum kilayim. It does not have the halachic status of kilayim. What's kilayim? So kilayim, we discussed previously, can mean a few things, but in the context of clothing, it means what we call shatnez, a combination of wool and linen. But this garment does not have the potential for being kilayim. Why not? Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz first. It's exactly what Rashi says. It's made of hard felt, and it's not really made out of a weave. And the prohibition of different kinds only applies to something that's woven, not some kind of clump. So again, I'm not envisioning precisely what we're talking about, but it seems like it's some kind of felt compression of fibers, and it's not woven together, and therefore it doesn't have the status of kilayim. Rashi says, "Sha'asuya kimin levet shekarim pultra ve'inativia." It's not woven; it's more compressed, like felt. Is that what felt is? Unwoven, compressed fibers? At least that's what it meant over here. That's halacha number one. Might be surprising. A garment that doesn't have to worry about kilayim, yeah, because it's created in a way that's not susceptible to kilayim because it's not woven. The eina mitama v'negoyim, and because it's not really a conventional type of garment, it also will never become problematically afflicted with saras, with leprosy, because the conditions for leprosy too is that it's on a woven kind of garment. Rashi, mahai taima, for this very reason, the gabe negoyim ksiv nami beged, because the Torah uses the word beged when it describes negoyim, saras, yolef mikilayim, and we actually infer from the laws of kilayim, shua v'tovi, it has to have, what are the right words? The way, when you thread something, so you have the two directions of thread that makes it woven. If it doesn't have there's woof and the woof and the loop, or loom, something like that. I don't know. Loof and warp. Woof and warp. Okay. Anyone? Yeah. Okay. And thirdly, but you may not go out into the public domain on Shabbos. This would be reflective of the statement of our Mishnah that a kabul, no, not a kabul, I'm sorry, no, take that. That an istama cannot go out into the public domain. Rabbi Shimon Amru, and Rabbi Shimon added, Af ein bo mishum atrois kalos. This also does not have the halachic restriction of atarot kalot. Rashi, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Gemara in Soita tells us that there were a number of decrees, a number of gezeros of mourning, to perpetuate mourning so that we don't forget that we're in Gullus and it's a miserable time. And one of the things they decreed was that there were certain bridal crowns and adornments that cannot be used. But if you were going to have this istama, you're going to have this kind of felt garment, that would not be a problem for a kala to wear, because the way I understand it anyways, it's not so schmancy. It's this kind of felt, compressed fibers. It's not really a garment worth its. And that concludes this discussion. Or actually, okay, I'm sorry, no. Now we talked about a kabbalah. Kabbalah we said was the hairnet. Originally we said it might have been a servant's thing. But the Gemara concluded by the teaching of Rabbi Abahu that it was the garment worn on a hairnet. Now we're going to see a different opinion. And by the way, we've turned our page to 58A. We're covering ground today to make up for a few slow days. So shkoyach. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel disagrees and says no. Kavla de avdotnan. When the Mishnah says a kavla, it means the servant's badge or seal. Rashi, kabel de masnisin, kavla de avlo pliga de Rabbi Abahu. He argues with Rabbi Abahu. Shmuel says it's a servant's We Amar Shmuel Hachi, does Shmuel really agree that a Kabul in the Mishnah means Shmuel, does Shmuel really say that it's a servant seal? The Amar Shmuel actually taught something very interesting. Yoitze ha'eved b'choisam shebet savarai. Shmuel taught that a servant is actually allowed to go out on Shabbos with a seal or badge, as I'm calling it, around his neck. But not when it's on his clothing. They would make these clay seals or badges that would be worn around the neck. But not if it's attached to the garments. If that's the case, Shmuel's contradicting himself. On one hand, Shmuel teaches the Mishnah to say that Kavla is the servant's badge or stamp or seal that may not be worn on Shabbos, but he himself taught that a slave actually may go out on Shabbos with this thing on his neck. Loi Kasha, the Gemara says, it's not really a problem. When can a slave go out on Shabbos? If his master made it for him. Rashi. Islay Imsa. He's afraid of his boss. He'll never take off to carry it. Because maybe if he takes it off, it might fall and crack and break. But his master will suspect that he takes off the stamp because he wants to claim that he's a free person. He's not subject to his boss's authority. But if the servant made it for himself, and Rabbi Steinsaltz says something very good to consider. I was initially thinking, and I'm sure you're thinking too, what kind of slave is looking to broadcast that they're a slave? But I think we have to consider that slaves in general, unfortunately, in the time of the Gemara, were not considered first class. They weren't considered the elite, let's say, and they may have been subject to some kind of hassle. But if they could show that they belong to a master who's not worth messing with, well, then they might enjoy the protection of the name of the boss. And I was listening to a clip that someone sent me, which was making an interesting yet controversial claim. It was a discussion about slaves and the Torah and the Gemara. And again, not at all to justify slavery, but to understand that in a crazy world, sometimes an impoverished individual may have, like we know that Eved Ivri was a Jew who sold himself as a slave. For certain people at certain times, to be a slave meant that they were cared for in a certain way where impoverished free people might have not had. So not to say that anyone wants to be a slave, but there may have been certain perks. And so in this instance, a servant may have actually wanted to broadcast who their boss is, so they won't be hassled and no one will mess with them. And so Shmuel says that if a servant made it himself, he can't carry it, but if his boss made it, he can't carry it. So now the Gemara says, "But Shmuel, why are you assuming that the seal that his master made for him, it can be carried? My life, if that's the case, then why can't it be on his clothing? Why does it need to be around his neck?" So the answer is Dilma Mifsak. It might break. It might fall off. Umir Tas, and he's very scared that his master is going to not be happy. And he would fold his garment in a way to hold the seal, so when he gets home, he still has it. And therefore, when it's on the garment, we're afraid that he'll end up carrying it. Rashi, hatalas al kseivo. You might wrap the talis, his garment, on his shoulder. He even learns it differently because he doesn't want his master, his boss, to see that it came off. And when he has the talis, he has the clothing carried on his shoulder, then it's like he's carrying. Yes.
When the Jews were walking around during the Holocaust on Shabbos and they had this Star of David pinned onto them, was that against the halacha?
Doesn't matter. They had no
First
choice.
of all, pikuach and nefesh, you can do whatever you need to, right? Obviously, they weren't really given a choice. And I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I mean, I will just add, I don't know much, but I think they were stitched onto the clothing, so that would already be a different story. Here we're talking about a thing that was prone to falling off. It was made out of clay and it was heavy. But something that's designed, that's part of a design. But again, let's leave it at that. Dilma mivsak, it might break, and he's afraid that it'll fall off, and he'll end up carrying it. Kid Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, akin to what Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef taught. Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Rav Yochanan HaYosef v'talis mikupeles u'munachas l'kseifa b'Shabbos chayv chatas. You're not allowed to, long story short, you're not allowed to have a talis folded up and thrown over your shoulder. Because then you're carrying, you're not wearing.
Oh, yeah?
And similarly to what Shmuel told Rav China Bar Shela. Kulu Rabbanon de Bereish Gelusa Leilivku B'Sarbale Chasime. All of the rabbis who were on staff, who were connected to the Exilarch de Reish Gelusa, they should not wear the seals that they would wear to show their affiliation and support to the Reish Gelusa, lebar minach. Besides for Chinina Bar Shela, the lekapti alayich the Reish Gelusa, because the Exilarch respects him enough that he doesn't need to wear it. This is a kind of an interesting dynamic that we probably not even going to have enough time to really flesh out and figure out. Rashi explains. The rabbis who were on the staff, if you will, or under the authority of the Reish Gelusa, would have these seals that would be on their clothing. I'm imagining almost, you know, those talus clasps?
Yeah.
But here they would wear a cloak, and the cloak would have to be pinned. And so they would have a kind of seal that had the insignia or the logo of the Reish Gelusa, Ke'ein Avadim, almost as if they were slaves. Laharois Shenk Fufin the Reish Gelusa. This is a way to show great respect to the Exilarch. Well, they were told, Lelivku, they should not wear these on Shabbos. Because if they would wear it on Shabbos, they'd have to wear it on Shabbos. And if it would break, they would be afraid to anger the Reish Gelusa, and therefore they might end up carrying it. Whereas Rabbi Chinan Bar Shela was such a prestigious person that the Reish Gelusa had enough respect that he wouldn't insist it. So I don't know, we need to study what's going on over here, but this seems to portray an interesting dynamic between the Jewish political authority and some of the rabbis that really, they were rabbis, but they were sometimes more like slaves. And I think if we'll speak to pulpit rabbis across the globe, tragically, many of them might find this Gemara to feel more familiar than we would be comfortable acknowledging. Dr. Hammer.
Question. Today, so you're not allowed, there's no Eruv. You're not allowed to carry the talus over your shoulder.
No.
Fine. Next. Can you use a clasp that you talked about that some people have in shul? Can you do that before you leave the house and walk with that? And the third question is, no clasp, can you tie it? Can you, the way sometimes people tie the two first forward parts of into the equivalent of a knot and walk with that?
Good question. I'm going to punt for now. Mirz Hashem, in the course of the Gemara, we'll see a lot of relevant text that discusses various perspectives on that. Good question, though, and again, worthy of discussion. But I'm very intrigued by this Gemara.
Okay.
What's going on over here? Was this something that they needed to do, or is this their way of showing respect? And what we do need to understand is that in the time of the Gemara, or at least much of the time of the Gemara, there was the institution known as the Reish Gelusa, the Exilarch, and this was, we've discussed this a number of times, this was like a very, very powerful political leader who was given authority by the monarchy or the ruling authority in Iraq and Persia many times. If you study the history, there were some fluidity and who exactly controlled Bavel at different times. But this position of Reish Galusa was a very strong, politically powerful, almost like a king. And the exilarchs were many times Talmidei Chachamim, and many times respectful for the rabbis, but many times there were also complicated dynamics. And sometimes there were different people vying for the position. And sometimes it appears that the rabbis needed it. Like in this era, they really felt compelled to do things to show their affinity, respect, and association with the Reish Galusa. I guess we'll have to leave it at that. Let's do a fast recap. Today, Baruch Hashem, we covered a lot of ground in the Gemara. We closed off a discussion about Ch6, about the interference of stuff and water, and it was namely the analysis of the Mishnah and Meseches Mikvaot, about hair, about the status of hair, human hair, being a Ch6, an interference between the water and the head, and thus potentially an issue on Shabbos or not. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not an issue. The Tanna Kama is silent. Rabbi Yosef says halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Abaye says, does anyone disagree? And ultimately the conclusion is everybody agrees that hair, when woven into the hair or to add volume or whatever it was done, is not considered a Ch6. That was the first discussion. Then we brought a brisa, a teaching in the name of Shmuel, I think, who was the one who quoted the teaching, and we inferred so from the Mishnah itself. Then we went on to discuss what a totefes was. We said that totefes was that kind of headband. Initially, we brought another interpretation, but that was rejected, or at least Abaye rejected it. Abaye says it's a kind of headband. And then we talked about the headband and the sarbitin, which were the things that dangled from the head. And we talked about how poor people would use material, rich people, precious metals to have bling on their head gear. We asked what a kabul was. And there are two interpretations, either the seal of a servant or a wool net. Rabbi Bahu says that it's a wool net, and he infers so from the Mishnah, and he quotes the teaching of Shimon ben Elazar, who actually was permissive of doing it because he felt that people wouldn't remove it on Shabbos. But that was his opinion. Parenthetically, we mentioned the kind of garment called an istama, and we said that an istama is that little felt material that would be put at the end of the bow, at the end of a braid, and it would also cover the hair, and it had three halachas. It's not considered kilayim because it's not woven. It's also not able to become a saras, the malady that would afflict certain garments for the same reason. And according to this teaching, you may not wear it into the public domain. And we also said that it's not considered a shmatzi enough hair garment that it would be prohibited in mourning of the Beis Hamikdash. Shmuel disagrees, and Shmuel says that it actually is a servant's seal. And we had a little bit of a discussion about that. We said that there's a distinction if the master made it or the servant himself made it. The master made it, the slave's afraid it's going to fall off, and therefore he might be compelled to do things which would not be in accordance to the laws of Shabbos. Whereas if he made it himself, maybe we're not so concerned. And then we actually quoted what was very intriguing to me in our final moment in the study. We quoted this comments of Shmuel, Rav Chinina, saying that rabbis should not be wearing these seals on Shabbos. And again, cluing us into the fact that it seems like there was this attempt, this effort to be, to show their affiliation and support for the Reish Galusa. That concludes today's Gemara. I want to thank you all for joining, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow as we'll continue talking about ancient style and Shabbos. Have a great day, a healthy day, and let's have lots of good news for everyone here and for all of Klal Yisrael.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Shalom Ber, are you going to do Chumash? Yep. All right, right after this, you're welcome to rejoin to study today's portion of Chumash.